Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one we only have developments in the southern part of the Donetsk region, where we see that the Russians have managed to advance south of Velika Novosilka as well as in the western flank of the settlement. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians managed to recapture some territories north of Velika Novosilka, attempting to strengthen their supply line and secure it. The Russians managed to make several advances south of Kudahove, where they are closing the pocket and expanding it at the same time. The Russians managed to advance in the northern flank as well, pushing towards the road connection between Pokrovsk in the north and Kudahove in the south, while also managing to infiltrate the defensive line of the Ukrainians south of Pokrovsk. Starting out in the south, the Russians have managed to capture the remaining parts of Novodarivka, which is an important settlement between the Zaporizhia and Donetsk border area, where the Russians now have one settlement between them and fire control over the road connecting the Zaporizhia region in the west with Huliaipole, with Velika Novosilka in the east. Gaining control over Novopil will allow the Russians to cut off the supply road, and it will allow them to get within close proximity of the Ukrainian defensive positions, which also means that the Ukrainians have a strong defense there. However, ahead of this defensive line, the Russians will be able to cut off the supplies and thereby limit the supplies going in and out of the Donetsk region from the south. At the same time, the Russians have managed to capture Blahodatne, which is located south of Velika Novosilka, in between two river lines in the east and in the west. Through this, the Russians now have operational encirclement over Makarivka, where the Russians now control the supply lines in and out of the city through direct fire control. This allows the Russians to hit any vehicles or infantry that moves in or out of the settlement. This will force a Ukrainian withdrawal from Makarivka towards Sturasheve, while at the same time, the capture of Blahodatne also flanks Sturasheve. This means a push along the fortified positions to the west of Sturasheve will allow the Russians to operationally encircle that settlement as well, to force a double withdrawal by the Ukrainians towards Neskushne, and thereby continue the offensive operations while the Ukrainians are on the move to push into Velika Novosilka from the south and gain full control over the Remevsky Lech area. And this is exactly why I talk about sustainability in terms of offensive operations in this conflict. During the 2023 Ukrainian summer offensive, they launched an offensive here in the Velika Novosilka direction in the Remevsky Lech, where their objective was to push through the Russian defensive lines. However, the force that they were exerting was not enough to break through the Russian lines, yet it was too much for them to do it sustainably over a long period of time. This meant that in October/November of 2023, the Ukrainian offensive ended and the Russian offensive began. The Russian offensive began very slowly. It was mostly focused around the city of Avdiivka in the northern flank of Donetsk, and then it spread across the entire Donetsk region. This slow process was one which the Russians could sustain over a long period of time. And we know that now because it has continued for a year and 2 months, yet it is still ongoing and still picking up speed. And now the Russians have not just reset the Ukrainian advances in the specific area where they were launching offensive operations in the Remevsky Lech area, the Russians have also gained significant positions, threatening the main settlements, the stronghold of Velika Novosilka in this direction, and gained a foothold within the settlement. The Russians are now launching operations in the northern flank, where they look to cut off and operationally encircle the entire settlement. However, the Ukrainians likely withdrew their forces from Blahodatne and the south of Velika Novosilka to then relocate them towards Novye Gumar and launch a counterattack, which allowed them to recapture the settlement. This has resecured the supply line going in and out of Novye Gumar. However, they only managed to recapture the settlement. They did not manage to recapture the fortified positions along the road. This means that the main road is still cut, between Pokrovsk in the north and Velika Novosilka here in the south, while at the same time the Russians are still within very close proximity to the road from their forward positions. This means that they are still within fire control over the road going through Novy Kumar, as the fighting continues over the settlement. This means that the Russians will likely look to recapture Novy Kumar and launch another offensive operations to the northern flank of Velika Novosilka. And we're seeing the advances in the south as well. The Russians are looking to gain full control over all supply routes in and out of the settlement to then operationally encircle it and capture it. This will lead to them capturing the most important logistical and stronghold supply hub in the area, which in turn would allow the Russians to significantly develop the offensive operations in the area. Towards the southern flank of Kurakhove, the Russians have made several advances. Although incremental, they are still significant in terms of full capture of Romanivka, which will allow the Russians to now develop offensive operations towards Svetlihai, Hanivka, and Uspenivka, as well as Trudove. These four settlements are what remains in the pocket. Taking a look at Dalny through the southern flank of Kurakhove, we can see that the settlement is located at an elevation of 162 meters. Just north of it, there are some high ground elevation positions, which are located at about 180 meters. The apartment complex area in the southern parts of Kurakhove is located at 150 meters. That means there's a 30-meter difference in favor of the Russians, while further deeper into Kurakhove, the lower the ground is. And this means that although the Ukrainians have the high-rise apartment complex buildings overlooking the area, the Russians still have control over the high ground just south of it. That means that they still have some sort of advantage to mitigate the Ukrainian advantage through the high-rise apartment complexes. The fortified positions of the Ukrainians north of Uspenivka are also located on the high ground at a higher elevation than Danilye itself, which means that the Russians would have to fight an uphill battle. This is why the main fighting is actually taking place from the east, north of Romanivka. The Russian objective would be to push along the high ground and then push towards the fortified positions with a combined strike from the low grounds north by Dalny and from the high ground in the east through the northern flank of Romanivka, Hanivka, and Uspenivka. It is unlikely that the Russians will develop offensive operations further in the southern flank towards Trudove and fortified positions south of Uspenivka due to vulnerability of these positions from the high ground fortified areas of the Ukrainians in the north. This is why the Russians redirected their forces to focus on Konstantinopolsk and Sukhyali, where they're looking to gain control over these positions further up along the river line. And now the Russians will likely develop further towards Yantarne as well, across the river line, as the Ukrainians do not have significant fortified positions in this direction. Instead, it is mostly focused around Uspenivka, which is the current choke point at which the Ukrainians are holding back the Russian offensive operations in the southern flank of Kurakhove. However, if the Ukrainians lose Yantarne, Konstantinopolsk, and Sukhyali, then Uspenivka will remain in an operational encirclement itself, and this will lead to a Ukrainian withdrawal or the collapse of the defensive of the Ukrainians here south of Kurakhove, which will then lead to the Russians flanking Kurakhove itself and operationally encircling the settlement, which they are already doing from the north with the capture of the remaining parts of Stary and now fighting is taking place over the high ground in the left flank of Kurakhove. The Russians' objective is to gain control over the waste heap overlooking Dashne, and this will allow the Russians to also cut off the main supply route in and out of Kurakhove. This with a combined strike on Yantarne, the Russians would be able to operationally encircle Kurakhove and overlook the settlement itself from the high ground to the south of the settlement and the high ground to the west of the settlement, while also having some high ground positions in the northern parts of the Vovcha river line or the Kurokhovka reservoir. Further north, the Russians managed to advance south of Pushkine along the forest lines, moving towards the flank of the fortified positions of the Ukrainians south of Pushkine. At the same time, the Russians have managed to capture the entirety of Novopustinka, and they've also managed to flank the Ukrainian positions along the Pokrovsk defensive line, where they've managed to reach the outskirts of Shevchenko across the river line. So they've made a river crossing north of Novopustinka, gaining a foothold in the outskirts of Shevchenko, and crossing over the river line, gaining a foothold and capturing fortified positions. While within Novopustinka itself, the Russians have gained full control over the settlement and are now fighting towards Novotoretsk. At the same time, with this road between Shevchenko and Novotoretsk now within close proximity to the Russian forces, the Russians now have operational fire control over this road, which cuts off Novotoretsk from a direct connection towards Pokrovsk, leaving only off-roads and dirt roads under Ukrainian control, limiting the supply of the settlement. This means the Russians will now fight over the fortified positions, move towards the flank of Novotoretsk, gain control over the settlement, and thereby flanking and cutting off the main supply road from Pokrovsk down towards Velikonovosilka and Kurakhove. This road is now within fire control of Russian forces, limiting the supply to the entire area in southern Donetsk. This road between Pokrovsk and southern Donetsk is truly the lifeline of the entire southern Donetsk, as this is the main supply road for this. However, this likely means that the Ukrainians will switch to supply lines further away, such as Myshova and Pokrovsk, further west and north from Pokrovsk. Although these settlements do not have the concentration of supplies or connection of roads and railways as Pokrovsk has, they'll still be able to supply the front line here in the south. However, again, it is within close proximity to the roads to the north of Rostolne, and a Russian offensive operation further down south will allow the Russians to cut off these supplies as well. In conclusion, the Ukrainian situation for supplies and offensive and defensive operations in southern Donetsk has worsened. However, it is not yet to a point where there would be any collapse in their defenses. It is instead at a point where the Russians are taking advantage of their operational and tactical advantages to the point at which the Ukrainians have a very difficult time defending and are defending at a disadvantage, a significant one, where they lack manpower and supplies, while the Russians are taking full advantage of their numerical superiority and their superiority in firepower to inflict as many casualties on the Ukrainians as possible during their defense of these localities in southern Donetsk, as they continue offensive operations towards Pokrovsk as well, developing their offensive towards the city. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.